I've been hosting late-night confessions for nearly a decade, and if there's one thing I've learned, it's that people love the anonymity of the dark. My show airs at midnight in Boston, when the city is quiet, save for the occasional siren or the distant hum of cars on the highway. It's a space for people to call in and share the secrets they keep hidden during the day, heartbreaks, regrets, and sometimes bizarre tales that teeter on the edge of believability. Most nights, the calls are predictable. I've heard it all: cheating spouses, wild workplace stories, and even the occasional "I think my house is haunted" confession. But one particular call, still keeps me awake at night, long after the on-air sign dims and the studio falls silent. That night started like any other. I had my usual setup: a steaming cup of black coffee in my Boston Celtics mug, a bag of gummy bears within reach, and the faint hum of the station's equipment filling the room. My producer, Mike, had already left for the night, leaving me alone in the studio, as was typical for this shift. The first few callers were nothing out of the ordinary. A man confessed to sneaking into his neighbor's yard to borrow firewood. A woman vented about her mother-in-law's constant meddling. It was the kind of content that kept listeners entertained without raising too many eyebrows. Then, at 12:47 a.m., the phone line lit up. "Late Night Confessions, you're on the air," I said, leaning into the mic. There was a pause, just long enough to make me think it might be a prank. Then I heard a man's voice, calm and deliberate, like he'd rehearsed every word. "Hi, Matt." Hearing my name threw me off. Most callers addressed me as host, or didn't bother with a name at all. Yeah, this is Matt. What's your confession?" He chuckled softly, the kind of laugh that makes your skin crawl. "It's not my confession I want to talk about. It's yours." I frowned, leaning back in my chair. "What do you mean by that? You don't remember, do you?" he asked, his tone almost playful. "Remember what?" I said, glancing at the clock. I dealt with my share of oddballs, and the best approach was usually to stay calm and steer the conversation. "How you broke your arm when you were 8. The old blue bike, the one with the frayed handlebar grips. You were racing Tommy down the street when you hit that pothole." My breath hitched. I hadn't thought about that in years. "Who is this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "You tell me," he said. "After all, you're the one who told me all about it." I forced a laugh, hoping to diffuse the tension. "Look, buddy, I think you've got the wrong Matt. Anyone could have guessed that story. Try harder." "Oh, I can't," he said smoothly. "Should we talk about the stash of candy in your kitchen? The one in the cereal box? Or maybe the argument you had with Jessica 2 nights ago? What was it about again?" Yes, her wanting you to move in together." My heart pounded. There was no way he could know these things. Jessica and I had argued in my apartment, with no one else around. And the candy stash? That was my childhood habit, something I hadn't mentioned to anyone in years. "How the hell do you know that?" I demanded, my voice louder than I intended. His laughter returned, low and chilling. "You told me. You just don't remember." Before I could respond, the line went dead. I stared at the phone, half expecting it to light up again, but it didn't. The silence in the studio was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the air conditioning. I shook my head, trying to brush it off. Maybe it was a prank, someone who'd done their research. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. I reached for my coffee, needing something to ground me. That's when the studio lights flickered. It wasn't unusual for the old building to have electrical hiccups, but this felt different. The flickering wasn't random, it was rhythmic, almost deliberate. I set the mug down and turned my attention to the equipment. Everything seemed fine, but the unease in my gut was growing. Then it happened. Through my headphones I heard a sound. At first I thought it was static, but as I turned up the volume, I realized it was humming. A tune so familiar it made my stomach drop. It was a lullaby. My lullaby. The one my mother used to hum when I was a child. I froze, every muscle in my body tense. The recording was faint, almost like it was coming from somewhere deep in the system. But that was impossible. There were no recordings of me humming, not now, not ever. "Mike?" I called out, even though I knew he wasn't there. The sound continued, looping over and over until I couldn't take it anymore. I ripped off the headphones and backed away from the console. The lights flickered again, plunging the room into brief darkness. When they came back on, I noticed something on the desk that hadn't been there before. A single piece of paper. I hesitated before picking it up. Written in shaky, uneven letters were the words, "Remember yet?" I didn't finish the show that night. I left the station, my heart racing and my thoughts spinning in 1,000 directions. I wanted to believe it was a prank, a clever, well-executed stunt by someone who knew me better than they should. But the humming? The note? Those weren't things I could explain away. The next day, I asked Mike if anyone else had been in the building that night. He shook his head. "Just you, man." "Why? Something happened?" I didn't tell him. I didn't tell anyone. Weeks passed, and nothing like that call happened again. But every so often, when I'm alone in the studio and the phone rings, I hesitate before answering. Because deep down, I'm afraid that voice will come back. And this time, I might remember what he's talking about. To this day, I don't know who or what he was. A prankster? A ghost? Some fragment of my own mind, reaching out to me in the quiet hours of the night? All I know is that midnight doesn't feel the same anymore. The confessions I hear now seem tame compared to the one I might still be hiding, from myself, or from whatever was on the other end of that line. I've been the host of Nighttime Reflections for 3 years now. It's a soothing talk and music show for truckers and night owls across the Midwest, with a loyal following who tune in every night. For the most part, it's a quiet gig, mellow conversations, easygoing music, and the occasional caller seeking advice or company. My audience is vast but distant, and most of the time, they just want someone to listen to them as they make long drives through the dark, empty highways. But one call changed everything. The night started like any other. I was seated behind the studio's worn desk, my coffee mug sitting just within reach and the low hum of the equipment filling the silence. The lights in the station flickered occasionally, but I'd gotten used to that. The building was old, a relic of the 70s with outdated equipment and faded walls, but it had character. The on-air sign above my head was glowing red, signaling that my show had begun. "Welcome back to Nighttime Reflections," I said into the mic, my voice warm and calm. "It's a quiet night here in the Midwest, and I'm your host, Luke, keeping you company while you cruise down those long, lonely roads. Let's kick things off with some classic tunes to set the mood." I pressed a button, and soft music filled the airwaves. It was a mix of jazz and slow country, the kind of tunes that make you feel at ease even when you're stuck in the middle of nowhere. The first few hours went by smoothly. Most callers were routine, a trucker asking for advice on dealing with road fatigue, a lonely man wanting to share stories from his travels, a woman asking for a dedication to her husband who was working the night shift. It was soothing work. The callers' voices, though distant, felt familiar in their own way. But then, just before 2 a.m., everything changed. The phone rang. "Nighttime Reflections, you're on the air," I said, picking up the line with my usual smile, though I could hear the faint tremor in my voice. The call sounded different, off somehow. It was quiet, almost too quiet. Then, a woman's voice crackled through, shaky and barely audible, as though she was struggling to catch her breath. Her sobs were thick and desperate. "Ma'am, are you okay? Do you need help?" I asked, trying to remain calm. I could hear her ragged breathing, and my stomach twisted into a knot. The sound was unsettling, but I'd dealt with upset callers before. Sometimes people just need to vent or talk through a tough moment. She didn't respond at first. I thought maybe she'd just gotten disconnected, but then, her voice came back, softer now, almost as if she was whispering through the phone. "He's watching you right now," she whispered, her voice eerie and slow, as though each word was dragged out of her with great difficulty. I froze. Her words hit me like a cold breeze, and my mind raced. Who was she talking about? I wasn't sure whether to laugh it off or take it seriously. A part of me wanted to comfort her, but another part of me felt like something was horribly wrong. My fingers trembled slightly over the mic. I tried to speak, but the words felt heavy. Ma'am, who's watching me? Where are you? What's going on? There was another long pause. Then, the most chilling thing happened. Her sobs stopped, suddenly, and without warning. In place of the crying was a deep, guttural laugh, one that seemed to crawl out of her throat like something unnatural. It wasn't a laugh of amusement. It sounded wrong, distorted, almost as if it wasn't coming from her at all. He's here, she whispered again. And he's coming for you. I felt my heart skip a beat. I wasn't sure whether to hang up, but something held me in place, something I couldn't explain. I glanced toward the studio's glass door. The hallway beyond was dimly lit, empty, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It was as if the very air in the room had thickened, making it hard to breathe. Then, as if on cue, I saw it. In the shadowy hallway, a silhouette of a man stood motionless. At first, I thought it was just the building's low light playing tricks on me, but no, this figure was too distinct to ignore. He stood still, just outside the studio door, barely visible in the darkness. For a moment I couldn't move. I felt like I was being watched. The figure didn't move an inch, as though waiting for something. Waiting for me. My stomach twisted into a tight ball. I tried to swallow, but my throat felt dry. I slowly reached for the phone, trying to maintain my composure. Ma'am, are you still there? I asked, my voice now trembling. Can you tell me where you are? There was no answer. Instead, the call cut out, the line going dead with a sharp, static hiss. My hand hovered over the phone, unsure whether to hang it up or wait for a return call. The room felt too quiet. The weight of the silence pressed in on me. I stared at the glass door. The figure was gone. There was nothing in the hallway but shadows and the faint glow of the emergency exit sign. I jumped up from my chair, my pulse racing. I ran to the hallway, my breath quick and shallow. I checked the entire area, the bathroom, the supply closet, even the stairwell leading to the roof. But there was no one there. Nothing had changed. Confused and uneasy, I returned to the studio and sat down, feeling the overwhelming presence of something I couldn't shake. I reached for the intercom, calling for the security guard. Hey Mike, everything good on your end? I saw something down here. A man in the hallway. Is there anyone else in the building? There was a long pause before Mike's voice crackled through the speaker. No, Luke. No one's been in the building since I locked up. I haven't seen a soul down there. You okay? I didn't answer immediately. I wasn't sure what to say. The feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. Well, I'm gonna check the security footage just to be sure, Mike added. I didn't feel any better, but there wasn't much I could do. I went back to the mic, trying to gather myself. The next few callers didn't help. I could barely focus, my mind still on the strange call. But I continued on with the show, talking about the usual topics, playing music, doing my best to keep my voice steady for the listeners. By the time the show ended, it was nearly 4 a.m. I had completely lost track of time, lost in the weirdness of the night. My thoughts kept circling back to the woman's voice, her cryptic words, and the shadowy figure I'd seen in the hallway. I decided to head home and get some sleep, hoping it was all just a bizarre coincidence. The next morning, I received a call from Mike. His tone was serious. Luke, I've been looking at the footage from last night, he said. There's something you need to see. My stomach dropped. The security footage showed nothing out of the ordinary, until I got to the part when I was talking to the caller. As I was standing in front of the studio window, I could see it clearly, through the glass door, a shadowy figure standing in the hallway, as though it was right there with me. The footage had been recorded hours after the call had ended. My blood ran cold. There was no way anyone could have entered the building unnoticed. Mike and I reviewed the footage together, but we couldn't explain what we were seeing. The figure wasn't on the earlier footage, but it appeared at the exact moment I was speaking with the woman. To this day, I don't know who, or what, was on the other end of that call. The figure, the strange presence, it all feels like a puzzle with pieces that just don't fit. And every night when I sit down in the studio, with the air thick around me and the familiar hum of the equipment in my ears, I can't help but wonder, what was watching me? And why? It was a stormy night during my after-hours request line show in Dallas, and I was wrapping up the usual requests, the familiar hum of the late-night callers and the sound of rain tapping against the windows. It was the kind of night that made the world feel small, almost claustrophobic. The kind of night when you could feel the tension building in the air, like something was about to happen. I'd been hosting the show for over 5 years now. Every week, I'd guide truckers, insomniacs, and anyone else who needed someone to talk to through the long, lonely hours of the night. Some callers were just looking for a bit of company, others for advice, and a few were downright strange. But that night, I had no idea just how strange things were about to get. The wind howled outside as I shuffled through the pile of song requests, trying to keep my focus on the music and chatter. My producer had gone home for the night, leaving me alone in the studio. It wasn't uncommon for me to work solo, and I'd grown accustomed to the quiet that surrounded the station after hours. The storm outside only added to the eerie stillness inside. Then, at 2:12 a.m., the phone rang. "After hours request line, you're on the air," I said into the microphone, my voice steady despite the creeping chill that had suddenly settled over me. There was a long pause before a voice came through, frantic and almost unrecognizable through the static. "Please, you have to help me," the man pleaded, his words rushed and erratic. "I've crashed my car, and I'm stuck. I think I'm dying." His breath was ragged, his voice a mix of panic and desperation. I immediately sat up straighter, my pulse quickening. This wasn't just a typical call for a song request or a random late-night ramble. This was serious. "Where are you? Can you tell me your location?" I asked, trying to keep calm, to offer some semblance of reassurance. He paused for a moment, and I heard him struggle to take a breath. "I'm on Route 64, just past the crooked tree. There's a farmhouse in the distance. It's so dark, I can't see anything else." The line crackled, and I could hear the storm pounding in the background. I felt a cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. I could feel his desperation, his fear creeping through the phone, and it made my stomach turn. "Okay, just stay on the line. I'm calling emergency services right now. Help is on the way." I was already dialing the dispatcher, trying to keep my composure while my mind raced. I gave her the details the man had described: the crooked tree, the farmhouse, the winding road. I was already preparing myself for the worst, the kind of situation where you're not sure if help will make it in time. It wasn't until I hung up the phone that the true weight of the situation hit me. The man's voice was still on the line, still breathing heavily. The storm outside had grown more intense, the wind howling louder than before. I turned back to the microphone, attempting to sound calm, but the sense of dread had already taken hold. Minutes passed like hours, each second stretching longer than the last. My fingers hovered over the phone, the red light flashing in the dark. It felt as though the room had grown colder, like the very air around me was thick with tension. Finally, the phone rang again. I snatched it up. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was the dispatcher. Her voice was shaky, almost as if she were struggling to speak. "There's been a mistake," she said, her words faltering. "The crash, it happened 10 years ago. That's the same location you gave me. The man, he didn't survive." I felt the blood drain from my face. The room suddenly felt suffocating. I struggled to comprehend what she was saying, my mind racing. 10 years? The man on the phone, was he a ghost? A prank? A figment of my imagination? "I don't understand," I managed to say, my voice tight with fear. "I just spoke to him. He was alive. He was begging for help. He was—" I trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. The dispatcher took a long, shaky breath. The crash happened in the same spot. The man didn't make it. His body was found in the wreckage, but there were no signs of life when they pulled him out. I could barely process what I was hearing. A million questions flooded my mind. Was this some sort of twisted prank? Was someone pretending to be this man, using his ghost to mess with me? But as I sat there, the silence on the other end of the phone, I realized something. The man hadn't hung up. The line was still open. And the heavy breathing from the other end was still there. I glanced at the phone, my heart pounding in my chest. Then, with trembling hands, I picked it up again. The man was still there. Breathing. Alive, or something. But no words came through. Only a steady, rhythmic inhalation and exhalation, the sound like someone in deep distress. Before I could speak again, the line went dead. The sudden silence in the studio was deafening. I stared at the phone, feeling a shiver run down my spine. What had just happened? Was I losing my mind? The storm outside was now relentless, and the lights in the studio flickered, casting long shadows across the room. I sat frozen in my chair, trying to process everything I had just learned. But the sense of unease wouldn't leave me. I glanced back at the clock. It was 2:47 a.m. The phone had been disconnected, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something, was still listening. I had heard the man's frantic voice, but now, I wasn't so sure if I had heard a ghost or if something darker had just made itself known. I tried to continue with the show, reading out the next request, but the words felt hollow in my mouth. The music played, but the melody seemed distant, like I was no longer part of the world around me. I was caught in a strange, unsettling fog. The hours dragged on, and when my shift finally ended, I didn't feel any sense of relief. I wanted to brush it off, blame it on a prank, or maybe a technical glitch, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The man's voice had been real. The dispatcher's words had been real. The fact that the man had been dead for 10 years, that was real too. The next day, I couldn't let it go. I called the police to inquire about the crash. The records matched everything I had been told. Route 64. The crooked tree. The farmhouse in the distance. But what they didn't have was any record of a phone call being made that night. That was the last time I worked a night shift alone in that studio. The events of that night have haunted me ever since. I've never been able to explain it, whether it was some sort of supernatural occurrence, or just a twisted figment of my mind. But every time I sit down at the mic, I can't shake the feeling that, somewhere out there, that man is still waiting. Still calling for help. And that, maybe, is the most terrifying part of all.